General Hayes ripped the Barrett 5D from her hands in front of the entire weapons bay. A joke. He said it loud enough for everyone to hear. That's what you are. A joke with a badge. Laughter moved through the room. Nobody stopped it. Maya Collins stood completely still. She looked at the general with eyes that had already seen the thing he was calling. Impossible had already done it alone at 19 years old, in a place he would never have clearance to know about. She said nothing. She didn't need to. In 72 hours on a mountain range at 3,200 meters, the Barrett she'd just been stripped of would confirm everything and silence every person in that room permanently. He had called her a joke. He had no idea he was already the punchline. If this story already has your attention, subscribe to the channel and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning Maya Collins arrived at Redstone Mountain Military Base, the sky was doing what it always did at altitude, pressing down low and cold, the kind of cold that gets into the joints and stays there. She had driven herself from the processing office, declined the escort that was offered, and walked into the weapons facility at 0638 with her kit bag over one shoulder and a notebook under her arm. She did not check in at the front desk the way most incoming personnel did. She walked to the rack, studied it for a moment, and reached for the Barrett M107 like she was reaching for something that belonged to her. That was when Staff Sergeant Dennis Howell saw her. Howell was a 14-year veteran who had been assigned to the weapons bay since returning from his second overseas tour. He managed access, supervised maintenance, logged every round that went in and out of inventory. He was not a complicated man. He believed in chain of command proper authorization and the idea that nobody put hands on a Barrett without going through him first. He had turned away captains for less. He crossed the floor in 6 steps. "Excuse me." His voice was flat and practiced. "That weapon requires a level 3 access clearance and a direct supervisory sign-off. Can I see your authorization card?" Maya didn't look up immediately. She was examining the rail system on the left side of the stock, running her thumb along the attachment point, the way a person does when they're checking something specific and not performing for an audience. Then she looked up. "I'm Sergeant Collins. I'm assigned here as of this morning." "I know who you are," Howell said. "I asked to see your authorization." She set the rifle down on the bench carefully, methodically. Muzzle pointed at the safe backstop without being reminded, and pulled a folded document from the front pocket of her jacket. She didn't hand it to him. She set it on the bench beside the rifle and stepped back. Howell unfolded it. "Read it. Read it again." His jaw moved slightly the way a jaw moves when a person is trying to figure out how to respond to something they weren't expecting. The document wasn't a standard access form. It was a memo from the base commander's office, stamped in red, authorizing Sergeant Maya Collins unrestricted access to all weapons facilities at Redstone Mountain, pending her formal evaluation period. No level 3 requirement. No supervisory sign-off. Just access open and direct, signed at a level that made Howell's rank look like a footnote. He refolded the paper with the kind of care people use when they are trying to look like something hasn't just surprised them. "All right," he said. "Welcome to Redstone." He walked away without another word. Maya picked up the rifle again and went back to examining the rail system. That was how her first 4 minutes at the base went. The call that reached General Richard Hayes came 20 minutes later. Hayes was not a man who took interruptions easily. He ran Redstone Mountain with the kind of precision that came from 31 years of military service and a temperament that had been described in 3 separate evaluation reports as exacting. He had earned that description honestly. He had spent 3 decades watching people underestimate the damage that one undisciplined soldier could do to a unit, and he had built his entire command philosophy around the idea that standards were not suggestions. When his aide, a young lieutenant named Greer, knocked and told him that a newly assigned sergeant had walked into the weapons bay and picked up a Barrett 50 without going through the standard intake process, Hayes was already standing up before the sentence was finished. "Which sergeant?" "Collins, sir. She had paperwork from the commander's office." "I don't care what paperwork she had. Nobody walks into my weapons facility and handles a Barrett on their first morning without a direct conversation with me first." He buttoned his jacket. "Where is she now?" Still in the bay, sir. I was at the weapons facility in less than 5 minutes. He moved through the door quickly enough that the soldiers in the bay noticed before he said anything, and the kind of stillness that follows a general's unannounced arrival settled over the room like a change in air pressure. Maya was at the bench. She had the rifle's bolt assembly removed and laid out in sequence on a clean cloth. She was not looking at the door. Hayes stopped 4 feet behind her. "Sergeant." She placed the piece she was holding back on the cloth in its correct position. Then she turned and came to attention and held it. "Sir." "What are you doing?" "Inspection and function check, sir. I noticed a slight inconsistency in the bolt seating when I cycled the action. I wanted to verify the tolerances before logging it." Hayes stared at her. "You've been on this base for less than an hour." "Yes, sir. And you decided your first act would be to disassemble a Barrett M107 without any supervisory authorization." "I had authorization from the commander's office, sir. That authorization covers your access to the facility. It does not cover an unsupervised field-level inspection of a weapon that requires, with respect, sir." Her voice didn't waver. It wasn't challenging. It was simply clear. "The document covers unrestricted access to all weapons facilities. If there's a bolt seating issue that hasn't been flagged in the maintenance log, every shooter who uses this weapon before it's corrected is operating with a risk that's already been identified and ignored. I didn't think that was acceptable." The room was completely silent. Hayes looked at the bolt assembly laid out on the cloth. He looked at the sequence. He looked at the fact that every piece was correctly positioned and in the right order, which was something he couldn't honestly say about every trained armorer he'd supervised. Then he looked back at her. "How long have you been working with this platform?" "I'd prefer not to say, sir." His eyes narrowed. "That wasn't a suggestion." "I understand, sir. I'd still prefer not to say." He had not had a sergeant tell him she preferred not to answer a direct question in a very long time. I wasn't sure anyone had done it to his face in the last decade. The audacity of it was so complete that it took him a moment to decide how to respond. "You'll report to my office at 0800, he said. "Full personnel file, everything." "Yes, sir." He turned and walked out. Behind him, he heard the soft, careful sound of her reassembling the rifle. He didn't look back. But he heard it, and the sound was precise and unhurried, and it bothered him more than he wanted to admit. In his office, Hayes pulled her file himself, rather than waiting for Greer to bring it. What he found was almost nothing. There was a name, a rank and enlistment date, a service branch designation, and a photograph that matched the face he'd just been looking at. There was a list of base assignments that read like any other mid-career sergeant's record training facilities, a couple of stateside posts, nothing overseas that was visible. There were evaluations. They were consistently high-written in the kind of careful approving language that supervisors use when they like someone but can't say more than they're allowed to. And then past the evaluations, there was a wall. Not a gap. Not missing records. An actual classification marker, a black level access restriction that sat across an entire section of her file, like a door that had been welded shut. Hayes had seen classified records before. He had held clearances that opened files most officers never saw. But this marker was at a level that told him without any ambiguity that whatever was behind it was not something he was authorized to know about. The only thing visible on the far side of the restriction was a single entry. Not a mission designation. Not a commendation. Just a number typed in standard font, sitting in the summary field as though it were a caliber measurement or an equipment serial number. 3200. Hayes stared at it. He turned it over in his mind. He considered the obvious interpretation meters, and then he set it aside because the obvious interpretation was impossible, and he was not a man who wasted time on impossibilities. He pulled out a legal pad and started writing questions. He had 6 of them down before Greer knocked to say that Sergeant Collins had arrived. She came to attention in front of his desk with the same quality of stillness she'd had in the weapons bay. Not stiff, not performative, just present. Hayes closed the file folder. He left it on the desk between them where she could see it. "Your record is mostly classified," he said. "Yes, sir." "Can you tell me why?" "No, sir." Can you tell me who classified it? She hesitated. Just for a moment. Not with discomfort, more like the hesitation of someone doing quick mental math. I can tell you that the classification was applied at a level above this command, sir. That's all I'm able to say. Hayes leaned back in his chair. He was a man who had spent his career reading people, and what he was reading from her was something he found genuinely difficult to categorize. She was not nervous. She was not performing composure. He knew what performed composure looked like: the slightly elevated chin, the controlled breathing that went just a fraction too regular. She was simply calm, the way people are calm when they have been in situations that made this kind of meeting feel like a warm room. There's a number in your file, he said. In the summary field, after the classification block. She didn't respond. 3,200, he said. What does that mean? She looked at him steadily. It means what it looks like, sir. He waited. Meters, she said. The words sat in the room. Hayes placed both hands flat on his desk. He was very careful about his voice when he said, Sergeant, the verified long-range record for a precision rifle shot is just over 3,400 meters, and that was achieved under controlled conditions by a two-person team with spotter support, specialized ammunition, custom ballistic data, and 3 attempts. You are telling me that this number... I'm telling you what the number means, sir. I'm not asking you to believe it. He stared at her. She stared back. You're not going to give me anything else, he said. Not today, sir. That is an extraordinary answer for a sergeant to give a general. Yes, sir, I know that. He picked up the file folder and set it aside. He had been in command for 9 years. He had dealt with every variety of enlisted personnel that the military produced: the gifted ones, the troubled ones, the ones who were exactly what they appeared to be, and the ones who were something else entirely underneath the rank insignia. He had a strong sense of which category a person fell into within the first minutes of talking to them. Maya Collins fell into a category he had not encountered before, and that fact alone told him something important. You'll be evaluated in 3 days, he said. Long-range qualification range, full protocol. Yes, sir? And between now and then, you will go through standard intake processing. You will not touch any weapon in this facility without a supervisory signature, and you will not have any more unauthorized conversations about your classification history with anyone on this base. Are we clear? Yes, sir. Dismissed. She turned and walked out. The door didn't close loudly. It barely made a sound. Hayes sat for a moment after she was gone, looking at the space where she'd been standing, and then he picked up his phone and called a number. He rarely used an old contact at the Personnel Records Office in Washington, who owed him more than one favor, and started asking questions that he was fairly sure would not get answered. He was right. They didn't. By afternoon, the base knew about her. Not everything, because there was nothing much to know. But the story of the new female sergeant who had walked into the weapons bay on her first morning and handled the Barrett without asking anyone's permission, who had gone toe-to-toe with General Hayes and walked out of his office without being removed from the post, that story moved through the enlisted quarters and the NCO mess and the briefing rooms with the speed that interesting stories always move through a closed military community. Most of the responses were skeptical. She must have a connection somewhere, said Sergeant First Class Terry Aldridge, who had been running the long-range for 6 years and had trained more shooters than he could name. He was eating lunch in the NCO mess when the story reached him, and his reaction was the reaction of a man who has seen many things oversold. Nobody gets a blanket authorization like that out of the commander's office unless someone upstairs is doing them a favor. Maybe she's actually good, said Corporal Dana Reyes, which was the wrong thing to say in this particular conversation, and she knew it immediately. Aldridge looked at her over his tray. How good? Good like she qualified expert. Good like she hit targets in competition. What does good mean to you? Reyes, because good doesn't get you classified records and unrestricted weapons access on day 1. That gets you a pat on the back and a commendation letter. Reyes didn't answer because she didn't have an answer. The conversation that followed covered several theories. A family connection to a flag officer, a political appointment of some kind, a diversity initiative mishandled at the administrative level, and at least one suggestion that she was actually some kind of inspector from the Pentagon doing an undercover evaluation of the base, which was the most creative theory and the least likely. Nobody considered in that conversation, or in any of the conversations happening around the base that afternoon, that she might simply be what the number in her file suggested she was. Captain Daniel Walker heard the story third hand and found it less interesting than everyone else seemed to. Walker was the officer who had been assigned to oversee the formal evaluation. He was 38 years old, a former competitive shooter who had transitioned into an instruction and evaluation role after a shoulder injury made extended field work difficult. He had a particular gift for assessing shooters, not just their technical execution, but the way they moved through the process, the decisions they made when the conditions changed, the things their body language communicated when they thought nobody was specifically watching them. He had agreed to walk by the weapons facility before dinner, not because he was curious about the rumors, but because he had learned early in his career that it was always better to see something yourself than to build an opinion from other people's words. He found Maya at the rear bench, not handling any weapons. She was following Hayes's order precisely, but sitting with a notebook open in front of her and a set of printed meteorological charts that Walker recognized as the 3-day forecast data for the mountain range where the evaluation would take place. She was marking wind patterns, not in the general way that a shooter who has been briefed on conditions might note them. She was working through them with a pencil and a set of calculations that she was doing by hand in the margin of the notebook, cross-referencing the altitude readings with the forecast gusts at 500-meter intervals along the estimated line of fire. Walker stood at the edge of her peripheral vision for a moment. She didn't look up. Then he stepped forward enough that she would notice him without it being a surprise because he was a person who thought about how he entered a space. She looked up, came to her feet. "Sir?" "At ease." He nodded at the charts. "How far out are you working the trajectory?" She glanced down at the notebook. 3,200 meters, sir. I'm trying to establish the wind layer profile at each 500-meter marker. The forecast shows 3 distinct shear layers between 800 and 2,000 meters, and I want to understand how they interact before I'm standing on the range. Walker sat down across from her without asking permission, which was the prerogative of his rank. He turned one of the charts to read it. "You're using Kestrel data." "Yes, sir, combined with the forecast model. The Kestrel alone at that distance isn't enough. The margin of error compounds across the shear layers. You need to account for how each layer affects the projectile's drift before it enters the next." He looked at the calculations in the margin. They were correct. He knew because he checked 2 of them in his head, and they matched hers. "Where did you learn to do this?" he asked. "I can't fully answer that, sir." He looked at her. "Because it's classified." "Yes, sir." "Have you actually fired at this distance?" She met his eyes and said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. Walker set the chart down. He had worked with a lot of shooters over the years, people who had genuine elite-level ability, and people who believed they did, and the distance between those 2 groups was vast, and usually visible within the first few minutes of conversation. The people who had real ability tended to be quieter than expected. They tended to be interested in the technical details of a problem in a way that felt procedural rather than demonstrative. They tended to not care very much what you thought of them, because what you thought of them was not the relevant variable. Maya Collins was doing all of those things. Walker stood up. "I'll see you at the range in 3 days, he said. "Yes, sir." He walked out, and he did not mention to anyone what he had seen, and he did not share the thought that had formed in his mind during that conversation. He had learned over the course of a career that had brought him into contact with some genuinely extraordinary marksmen that there was a way a person looked when the number they were working toward was not a goal, but a memory. She had looked exactly like that. The 3 days between Maya's arrival and the evaluation were 3 days of a peculiar kind of tension that the base had not experienced before. Not the tension of a crisis or a conflict, but the tension of a thing that cannot be resolved until a specific moment arrives. In the NCO quarters, Aldridge had moved from skepticism to something closer to irritation. He had pulled his own research on long-range shooting records and presented the findings to anyone who would listen, explaining in patient detail why the physics of the claimed distance were nearly prohibitive, and why the margins required would be essentially impossible to achieve with standard military equipment and a single shooter working alone. I was not wrong about any of it. He was also in ways he didn't realize describing exactly the kind of conditions that made someone's classified record worth classifying. In the junior enlisted quarters, the conversation was different. Younger soldiers had a natural instinct toward the story, the way people always have a natural instinct toward the possibility that something they've been told is impossible is not actually impossible. A few of them had already made the private calculation that if she actually did it, they wanted to have been the people who believed it was possible. One of those soldiers was Private First Class Amara Osei, 23 years old, 6 months into her assignment at Redstone, who had signed up for range observation duty on evaluation day. For reasons she would not have been fully able to explain if anyone had asked her. She would later say that she just had a feeling. Maya spent those 3 days doing exactly what she had been doing when Walker found her working through the problem, the way she always worked through problems methodically, without drama. Cross-referencing every variable she could access, and building a clear picture of the conditions she would face. She slept 7 hours each night, which was the amount she knew she needed. She ate the same meals in approximately the same amounts. She did not talk to many people. Not because she was unfriendly, the few conversations she had were warm and direct, but because the preparation required a kind of internal quiet that social engagement disrupts, and she was experienced enough to protect that quiet without apology. At night in the 20 minutes before she slept, she would sometimes sit with the notebook closed and simply hold the weight of what she was carrying. Not the shot, not the range. The other thing, the thing behind the classification block. The number that came from somewhere specific from a specific moment on a specific day, from a decision she had made at an age when she hadn't fully understood what decisions of that magnitude cost. She was 26 years old now. She had been carrying it for 7 years. It had not gotten lighter, but she had gotten stronger, and at some point, those two things reached an equilibrium that allowed her to function at the level she needed to function. She had never told anyone about the origin of the number. Not the full story. The people who knew had been in the room, or they had been given the declassified summary, which was a different thing entirely. A summary is a fact without weight. Weight and the fact of what happened on that day had enormous weight. The kind of weight that changes the dimensions of a person permanently. She did not expect anyone at Redstone to understand that. She did not expect General Hayes with his sharp eyes and his precise command and his clear and genuine belief in standards to understand it either. But in 3 days, he was going to watch something, and whatever he understood or didn't understand about the weight of it, she would do the work correctly. She always did the work correctly. That was the only thing she had ever been able to control about any of it. She closed the notebook. She turned out the light. She slept. She was already awake when the alarm she hadn't set would have gone off. That was how it had always been with her, ever since the early years of training. Her body made its own decisions about readiness and sleep. Ended not with exhaustion running out, but with something quieter and more deliberate. A kind of internal switch that flipped when the preparation was complete. She lay still for 30 seconds, running through the wind data she had memorized the night before, checking it against what she could feel in the air pressure around her. Then she got up, laced her boots in the dark, and went to the range before anyone else arrived. She wasn't supposed to be shooting yet. Evaluation was still 2 days out. But walking the ground was different from shooting on it, and nobody had told her she couldn't walk. So she walked the full distance from the firing position to the limit of what she could see, pacing it out in her mind, the way she'd been taught to do years before she was allowed to call herself a marksman. She stood at the forward edge of the designated firing area and looked out at the mountains and let the wind come to her, not as weather, but as data, feeling for the inconsistencies in it, the places where the air moved differently because of what the terrain did to it. She was still standing there when Captain Walker arrived and found her. He stopped beside her without speaking for a moment. He looked out at the same stretch of distance she was looking at. Then he said, "You do this before every evaluation." "I do this before everything," she said. He nodded slowly. The wind shifted overnight. You feel that? Yes, sir. The third layer moved about 40 meters lower than the forecast predicted. It changes the interaction point with the second layer by roughly 800 meters downrange. He turned to look at her. You calculated that from feel. From feel and from what the forecast said it should be. When those two things don't match you, trust what you feel. Walker had been shooting for 20 years. He had mentored shooters who had gone on to compete at the highest levels the military offered, and a handful who had gone further than that into specialized programs he wasn't at liberty to discuss in any detail. He had heard the phrase, "trust what you feel," from exactly two of those people before Maya Collins, and both of them had been the kind of marksmen whose names were spoken in hushed, respectful tones, in rooms he was occasionally invited into. He did not say any of this to her. "Aldridge is running a training session this morning," he said instead. "He's asked me if you'd participate. Observe at minimum." She turned to look at him. "Is that an order, sir?" "It's a request. From him through me." "What does he want?" Walker was quiet for a moment. "I think he wants to get a look at you before the evaluation. He's been running this range for 6 years, and he's protective of it. He wants to make sure his words that whoever is standing on his firing line in 2 days knows what they're doing." Maya looked back out at the distance. "And if I say no, then I tell him you were busy and he'll deal with it." She was quiet for a beat. Then she said, "I'll observe. I won't participate unless he asks me directly." "That's fair." "Tell him that's the deal." Walker almost smiled. "I'll pass it along." He left her standing there with the wind coming off the mountain, and he thought on his way back to the facility that she was the only person he'd ever met who negotiated the terms of watching something. The training session Aldridge ran was for a group of 8 advanced shooters, soldiers, who had already qualified expert and were working toward specialized marksman designation. He ran it tight. He ran it exactly the way he'd been running sessions for 6 years, with precise time windows and clear correction protocols, and the kind of specific language that experienced instructors develop over years of watching the same errors repeat themselves. Howe was good at it. Anyone watching could see that. He knew the platform, knew the range, knew the way the mountain air affected trajectory at different times of day, and he communicated all of it in language that his shooters could apply immediately. Maya stood off to the side and watched. She held a notebook but didn't open it. She had her hands at her sides, and she watched every shot with the same quality of attention. Unhurried, complete, the kind of watching that is its own form of work. After the 4th shooter's series, Aldridge walked over to her. "Anything stand out to you?" he asked, and there was something layered in the way he asked it. A test embedded inside a question, the kind of thing experienced people do when they want to see how someone handles a situation where the honest answer might not be welcome. "Private Cerna," she said immediately. "His left shoulder is dropping on the exhale just before he fires. It's not visible from behind the line, but from here you can see it. He's compensating by adjusting his aim after the breath cycle, instead of before it, which means the adjustment happens at the least stable moment in the process." Aldridge was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I've been watching Cerna for 3 weeks. You probably see it," she said. "You just can't see it from the angle you work from." He stared at her. "You want to tell him?" "That's your call, Sergeant. I'm only here to observe." He looked at her for another moment with the expression of a man who is genuinely trying to figure something out and is finding the task harder than he expected. Then he walked back to the line and spent 4 minutes with Private Cerna's positioning. The next shot Cerna fired was his best of the session. Aldridge knew it was better before the target data came back. He looked over his shoulder at Maya. She was already writing something in the notebook. He didn't ask her about the session again. But he thought about it for the rest of the morning, and when he sat down in the NCO mess for lunch, and Corporal Reyes started to bring up the subject of Sergeant Collins. Again, he cut the conversation off with a single word and ate the rest of his meal without speaking. The skepticism was still there, but it had shifted its posture slightly, the way skepticism does when it encounters something it wasn't prepared for. General Hayes had made 7 calls in 2 days and gotten exactly no useful information about Maya Collins's classified record. The contacts who would normally have helped him people at the Personnel Records Office, a deputy G2 he'd worked with for a decade. Two former colleagues, now stationed in positions that gave them access to classification archives, had each told him in different words, and with varying degrees of apologetic formality, that the access restriction on her file was above their clearance level and there was nothing they could do. One of them, the deputy G2, had said something that Hayes kept returning to. "Rich, I'm not saying I can't get in. I'm saying the clearance level required to open that block is the kind that generates a notification when you try. I'm not generating a notification over a sergeant's file." Hayes had thanked him and hung up and sat with that information for a while. The clearance level that generates a notification. That was a specific thing. That was not a routine classification. That was the kind of restriction that got applied to records associated with operations that the government had very strong reasons to keep completely dark. The kind of operations that if they became known would be embarrassing or significant or both. You didn't put that level of restriction on a field-grade officer's record unless you had to. You certainly didn't put it on a sergeant's record unless the sergeant had been part of something that the people who made those decisions believed was too important to leave visible. Hayes was not a man who was easily impressed. He had been in the presence of genuine excellence many times over the course of his career, and he had learned that excellence usually looked different from what people imagined. Quieter, more precise, less interested in its own reflection. What he had seen of Maya Collins was consistent with that. What he couldn't get past was the gap between what was visible and what he suspected was underneath it, and the fact that he couldn't get to the information he needed was doing something unfamiliar to his composure. He called his aide in. "Set up a meeting with Sergeant Collins for this afternoon. My office. Informal." Greer hesitated. "Should I tell her the subject?" "No, just tell her I'd like to talk." When Maya arrived at his office that afternoon, she sat across from him with the same stillness she'd had at their first meeting, and Hayes looked at her for a moment before he said anything, trying to find the approach that would get him something useful. "I want to ask you something off the record," he said. "I'll answer what I can, sir. The number in your file, the 3,200, did you put it there, or did someone else put it there?" She was quiet for long enough that it was its own kind of answer. Then she said, "Someone else put it there, sir. I didn't ask them to." "Why did they put it there?" "Because it was accurate." Hayes leaned forward. "Sergeant, I need you to understand something. In 2 days, you are going to stand on a firing line in front of this entire base, and every person watching is expecting one of two things. Either you're going to fail in a very public way, and this is going to be a very uncomfortable situation for everyone, or you're going to do something that I currently do not have the framework to predict. Either way, I am responsible for what happens on that range. I am responsible for the personnel on this base, and I am running an evaluation with almost no information about the person being evaluated because her record is sealed behind a clearance level that my own contacts won't touch. So I am asking you off the record, soldier to soldier, give me something." She looked at him. Something moved in her expression. Not softness exactly, but a kind of recognition, the way a person looks when someone they hadn't expected to has said something real. "I was 19, she said. He waited. "I was embedded with a unit that I'm not going to name, in a location I'm not going to name. There was a situation where the timeline collapsed faster than anyone expected, and the options that were supposed to be available weren't available, and someone had to make a decision that would affect whether other people came home." She stopped. "I made the decision. I made the shot. And then the people above me decided that what I'd done was something that needed to stay very quiet, for reasons that I understood and still understand. They put the number in my file as I don't know exactly what it was as. Documentation maybe, or a marker. Something that someone with the right access would be able to read." Hayes sat very still. "You were 19 years old." "Yes, sir." "Alone." "Yes, sir." He absorbed this. He had been in the military for 31 years, and he had heard many things, and he had developed over those years a reliable instinct for the difference between someone who was constructing a story and someone who was reporting one. She was reporting. She was doing it with the matter-of-fact precision of someone who had told this story to no one and was now telling it to the first person who had asked in exactly the right way. "Who knows?" he asked. "The people who were there, the people who classified it. You now, sir." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What do you need from me before the evaluation?" She blinked. It was the first fully unguarded response he had seen from her. She hadn't expected that to be the next question. "Sir, you're here. You've been assigned to this base for reasons that nobody has explained to me, and that apparently nobody is going to explain to me. You're going to do an evaluation in 2 days that I suspect is going to be significant. What do you need from me to do it correctly?" She thought about it genuinely, not performing consideration, but actually considering. "2 things, sir. I need the range clear of everyone except essential observation personnel. If there's a crowd, it changes the acoustic environment and complicates my concentration protocol. And I need you to be the one who calls the confirmation. Not a radio operator, not an aide. You." "Why me?" She looked at him steadily. "Because I want the person who doubted me most to be the one who says the word." Hayes held her gaze for a long moment. Then he said, "All right." She stood, came to attention, and left. Hayes sat for a while in his empty office and thought about a 19-year-old girl alone in a position he couldn't picture in a location he couldn't know, making a decision that had apparently been significant enough to bury for 7 years. He felt something he hadn't expected to feel. It was not quite guilt. It was closer to the very specific discomfort of realizing that your first impression of a person had been not just wrong, but wrong in a way that cost them something. The word spread anyway, despite Hayes's informal preference for discretion. It always did on a base this size. Not the details. Nobody knew the details, but the basic shape of the story. General Hayes had sat down with Sergeant Collins one-on-one, a thing he almost never did with enlisted personnel, and afterward, he had put in a request to restrict evaluation day observation to a specific list of personnel. That restriction was its own piece of information, and people read it accordingly. Aldridge heard about it in the early evening and said nothing. He was sitting with the session data from the morning, going back over Cerna's numbers, and the pattern Maya had identified was there in the data, as clearly as if it had been highlighted. 6 weeks of watching Cerna's scores, and he had been trying to track the inconsistency to its source, running through the usual suspects: grip, pressure, breath cycle, trigger, discipline. And she had named it in 30 seconds from the side of the firing line without being asked. I wasn't going to revise his skepticism out loud. That wasn't how he operated. But in the privacy of his own assessment, something had already shifted. Reyes, meanwhile, had done her own research. She wasn't a shooter. Her role on the base was administrative, and her interest in long-range marksmanship was more conceptual than practical. But she had looked up what she could find on the public record about extreme long-range shooting, about the physics of it, about what was theoretically achievable, and under what conditions. She had found in the process a reference to a classified operational record from approximately 7 years prior that had never been formally published, but that had been mentioned in a redacted footnote of a military review document she had accessed through the base's reference library. The footnote said only that a long-range precision engagement had been recorded at an unofficial distance during an operational context that precluded standard verification, and that the distance involved, if accurate, would represent an achievement beyond current documented records. The document was dated 7 years ago. Reyes sat with that for a while. Then she closed the document and did not share what she had found with anyone, because she understood, in the way that thoughtful people sometimes understand things, before they can fully articulate why that some information exists in a space where sharing it changes it, and that what was in that footnote was still attached to something that hadn't finished happening yet. On the evening before the evaluation, Private First Class Amara Osei was sitting in the common area when Maya came through on her way to the small room she used when she needed to work quietly. Their eyes met for a moment, the way eyes meet between people who have been aware of each other without having spoken. "Sergeant Collins," Osei said. Maya stopped. "Private. Can I ask you something?" Maya looked at her for a moment. The quality of Osei's expression Direct, genuinely curious, without the performance of either skepticism or deference, was something she recognized and respected. Go ahead. Are you scared? The question was so direct and so honest that it briefly bypassed all of Maya's practiced equanimity. She stood with it for a moment, and then she said, "What makes you ask that? Because if I were doing what you're about to do, I'd be terrified. And I think the honest answer is more interesting than the other answer." Maya looked at her. Something in her expression changed, not significantly, but noticeably the way a wall changes when a window opens in it. "There's a difference," she said slowly, "between being scared of failing and being scared of something else." Osei waited. "Failing doesn't scare me anymore," Maya said. "I know what I can do. I know what my training is. I know the variables I can control, and I've accounted for the ones I can't. That part is just work, and work doesn't scare me." She paused. "What's harder is every time I do this I go back there. To the first time. And that place has a weight to it that doesn't go away just because 7 years have passed." Osei didn't press her on what there meant. She had the instinct not to. "Does it help going back to it?" "I don't go by choice." Maya looked at her for a moment longer. "Get some sleep, Private. Tomorrow's a long day." She continued down the hall. Osei watched her go and sat with the conversation in the way that meaningful conversations sometimes need to be sat with, not analyzed, just held. Hayes didn't sleep well. I was aware of this as a data point. He was not a man who lost sleep over personnel matters. He had made decisions that had cost lives, as every commander at his level eventually did, and he had learned to carry those decisions with the particular kind of resolve that comes from having thought through every option and accepted the weight of the one you chose. He did not lie awake revisiting those decisions, because revisiting didn't change them, and changing them wasn't an option, and his job was to function clearly. But Maya Collins was not a decision he had made. She was a decision that someone else had made at a level above his command to send a woman carrying a 7-year-old classified achievement to his base for an evaluation that nobody had fully briefed him on. And the thing she had told him in his office, the 19 years old, the collapsed timeline, the alone was sitting somewhere in his chest in a way that he couldn't quite dislodge. He thought about his daughter. 32 years old now, a surgeon in Seattle. He had missed more of her childhood than he liked to acknowledge, and she had become extraordinary anyway, in the way that some people become extraordinary, despite the structural absences in their formation, rather than because of the structural presences. He had always told himself that his absences had been for something, for the work, for the mission, for the institution. He had never fully stopped to ask what those absences had looked like from her side. I wasn't sure why Maya Collins was making him think about his daughter. The connection was oblique and possibly sentimental, which was not a word he generally applied to his own thinking. But at 3 in the morning, lying in the dark of his quarters and unable to locate the off switch. For his thoughts, he followed the connection where it went, and what it showed him was a young woman at 19 years old, in an impossible situation, with no one to call, and a decision to make that would stay with her for the rest of her life. And then the institution that asked for that decision had taken the record of it and sealed it away where no one could see it, and sent her 7 years later to prove herself again in front of a group of people who had already decided she wasn't worth taking seriously. Hayes stared at the ceiling for a long moment. Then he got up, went to his desk, and started writing something on a notepad. He wrote for about 20 minutes. Then he put the notepad in his desk drawer, which was a thing he did when he needed the act of writing to be complete without the written thing needing to be immediately actionable. He went back to bed. This time, he slept. The morning of the evaluation arrived overcast and sharp, the way mountain mornings arrive in early autumn, when the season is beginning to mean something. Maya was up at 5 through her preparation sequence by 6, and at the range threshold by 6:45. She carried only what she needed: the rifle, which she had checked and rechecked the previous evening. Under Howell's reluctant supervision, her notebook with the final wind calculations, and a small photograph that she kept folded in the chest pocket of her jacket and never looked at before a shot because she only needed to know it was there. Walker arrived at 7. Aldridge arrived at 7:15 without his usual group of trainees, just himself, and a clipboard he didn't refer to. A small cluster of base personnel who had been given observation clearance came through in a quiet, careful group, Reyes among them standing at the back. Osei had not been cleared for observation, but she had positioned herself at a point outside the formal boundary where she could hear without being inside the restricted perimeter, and nobody had technically told her she couldn't stand there. Hayes arrived last. He walked to the command position without speaking to anyone, and when he got there, he turned and looked at the firing line where Maya was already in position, and for a moment, he just looked the way a person looks at a situation that is about to resolve itself into something that cannot be undone. Then he said quietly to no one in particular, "All right, let's see what we've got." Maya heard him. She had excellent hearing, which was a thing nobody knew about her because it was not the kind of fact that appeared in a personnel file. She heard him, and she did not look up, and she did not respond. She was already somewhere else, not distracted, not dissociated, but in the particular internal space that this kind of work required, where the only things that existed were the rifle, the wind, the target. 3,200 meters away, that she could not see with the naked eye, but could see with every calculation she had made over the past 3 days. She began her breath cycle. Walker watched her and said nothing. Aldridge watched her and said nothing. The mountain wind came and went and shifted, and the trees at the edge of the range moved in the way they moved when the third layer was doing what she'd predicted it would do, and the data in her head aligned with the data in front of her eyes. And Maya Collins settled into the stillness that she had found the first time at 19 years old, when everything had been on the line, and there had been no one to help her, and the only choice was between doing the work correctly and something she couldn't allow. The world went quiet. Her finger found the trigger, and then she waited, because the wind needed one more second to complete its cycle, and she knew that, and she had the patience that comes not from temperament, but from the absolute knowledge that the correct moment was coming, and that hurrying it by 1 second would mean the difference between what she had come here to prove and everything she had been carrying since the day the number became her number. 1 more second. She waited. The second passed. She fired. The sound the Barrett made was not the sound people expected. If they'd only ever heard rifles in movies, it was bigger than that. More physical, a concussion that moved through the chest rather than just the ears. A sound that said something had been set in motion that could not be recalled. The recoil moved through her in the way she had trained it to move, absorbed and distributed, nothing wasted, nothing that disrupted her sight picture or pulled her off what came next. What came next was waiting. At 3,200 meters, a .50 caliber projectile traveling at subsonic speeds through 3 distinct atmospheric layers takes approximately 4 seconds to reach its destination. 4 seconds is a very short time when you are watching a clock. 4 seconds is an extremely long time when every person standing on a mountain range has just heard a rifle discharge and is waiting for information that will define in some irreversible way what they believe is possible. Nobody spoke. Walker had a stopwatch in his hand, and he did not look at it. He was watching Maya because he had learned over 20 years of evaluation work that the shooter tells you things before the target does. She had not moved. She had not shifted her position, or lifted her head, or done any of the small involuntary things that shooters do when they know a round has gone somewhere they didn't intend. She was exactly where she had been. The rifle was exactly where it had been. Her breathing had returned to the post-shot cycle she used slow, and even as though the most consequential 4 seconds of the morning were simply another interval in a process that had its own rhythm. Aldridge had his binoculars up, but they were pointed at the target position, and at that distance there was nothing visible yet. Nothing he could confirm, and he knew that, but he kept them up because it was something to do with his hands while the seconds finished passing. Hayes stood with his arms at his sides. He was looking at the same distant point Aldridge was looking at, but he was not using binoculars. He had spent too many years in command to betray his composure over a wait, and so he stood very still and kept his face controlled and felt underneath the control. Something that he had not expected, a specific tight anxiety that he realized after a moment of honest self-examination was not anxiety about failure. It was anxiety about success. Because if the round had gone where it was supposed to go, The ground under every assumption he had brought to this morning was going to shift in ways he could already sense, but not yet fully calculate. The confirmation station at the target end was a small automated system that relayed acoustic and sensor data back to the range command module. When the system registered an impact, it sent a tone followed by the confirmed distance and a hit designation. The command module was a device the size of a radio that Greer was holding 30 feet from Hayes. They all heard it. The tone was a flat electronic sound. 2 short pulses, the way the system always announced a confirmed registration. Then the distance readout. The system always read the distance in a flat automated voice that had been designed to be clearly audible at range. 3,200 meters. And then impact confirmed. Greer made a sound. It was not a word. It was the involuntary sound a person makes when their body responds to something before their brain has finished processing it. A sharp exhale that was almost but not quite a word, compressed into a single syllable that communicated everything without naming anything. Aldridge lowered his binoculars. He did not look at Maya. He looked at the ground in front of his feet, and his expression was the expression of a man who is rapidly recalculating a very large number of things simultaneously, and finding that the new figures do not resemble the old ones in any comfortable way. Walker stopped his stopwatch. He looked at the display. Then he closed his hand around it and put it in his pocket and said in a voice that was quieter than he intended it to be, "There it is." Hayes turned to look at Greer. "Read it back." Greer swallowed. 3,200 meters, sir. First round. Impact confirmed. Say it again. 3,200 meters. First round. Impact confirmed. Hayes turned back toward the firing line. Maya had risen from her position. She was standing now upright, the rifle in a safe carry, and she was doing something that nobody expected. She was writing in her notebook. She had the thing open on the small folding table beside the firing position, and she was writing down numbers with the same focused efficiency she'd had when Walker found her doing wind calculations 2 days ago, as though the confirmed first-round hit at 3,200 meters was a data point that needed to be recorded before it was a moment that needed to be acknowledged. Hayes walked toward her. He covered the distance between them in a way that his aide later described as purposeful, which was true, but was not the whole truth. The whole truth was that he walked toward her because he didn't know what else to do. And doing something was the only way he knew how to stay inside a moment that was threatening to become larger than his ability to contain it. He stopped beside her. She finished writing the entry. Then she closed the notebook and looked at him. "Sergeant Collins," he said. "Sir?" He had prepared several things he might say at this point, none of which he used because they had all been composed in the context of a possibility. He was now standing inside, and from inside it, they all sounded inadequate. What came out instead was honest and unrehearsed. "First round," he said. "Yes, sir." "No adjustment." "No, sir." He was quiet for a moment. "The wind changed twice during your breath cycle. I watched it change." "I know, sir. I waited for the third cycle. The third cycle had a 4-second window where all 3 layers were in the configuration I needed. I used that window." Hayes absorbed this. "How long were you waiting for that window?" 11 minutes. He stared at her. "You were lying completely still on that firing line for 11 minutes, waiting for a 4-second weather window." "Yes, sir. The shot was always going to be there. It was just a matter of identifying the correct moment. I didn't have an answer for that. Not a quick one anyway, and she wasn't asking for one." Walker came up beside them. His voice was completely steady because he had a great deal of practice keeping it that way. "I want to run the confirmation data through the formal documentation protocol before we discuss anything else," he said. "I want this in the record correctly." "Agreed," Hayes said. He looked at Maya. "Don't go anywhere." She nodded once, the kind of nod that meant she understood and would comply, not out of obedience, but out of the simple recognition that the next hour was going to involve a great deal of procedure, and she had no particular objection to procedure. What happened in the next 11 minutes was a kind of organized chaos that military facilities produce when something has occurred that nobody fully prepared for. The confirmation data was pulled from the system and verified manually by Walker, then cross-referenced with the sensor array data from the target station, then compared against the atmospheric log that had been running throughout the evaluation. Everything matched. The round had traveled 200 meters through 3 atmospheric layers, including 2 wind shear transitions, and had struck a target whose dimensions were consistent with long-range precision qualification standards, and it had done this on the first shot from a single shooter without spotter support. Walker documented all of this in language that was exact and careful, and that he would later describe in a conversation with Hayes as one of the most consequential pieces of paperwork he had completed in his career. While he did this, the small group of observation personnel who had been present processed what they had witnessed in their own ways. Reyes was standing very still with her notebook pressed against her chest. Not open, just held there like a physical object that was helping her stay grounded. She had found that footnote in the classified review document. She had understood when she read it that it was describing something that had already happened once. What she had just witnessed was the second proof of the same truth performed in public in broad daylight by the person who had first established it in secret at 19 years old. She thought about what that meant, about what it meant to carry a thing like that alone for 7 years, to walk into a facility where every face was skeptical, to be told without words that you didn't belong, and then to stand on a firing line and do the precise, controlled, technically perfect thing you had always been able to do, not because anyone believed you could, but simply because you could. She thought about the cost of that. Not the physical cost, which was considerable, the training, the discipline, the toll on a body of years of elite-level work, but the other cost, the one that didn't appear in any record. The cost of knowing what you were and being seen as something else over and over until the moment finally arrived when the evidence was undeniable. She opened her notebook. She wrote down the time and the confirmed distance and closed it again. Aldridge was having a different experience. He had moved away from the group and was standing alone at the far edge of the observation area, and he was doing what he sometimes did when his understanding of something had to be significantly revised. He was breaking it down systematically, going back through everything he had said and thought about Maya Collins since the moment her name first appeared in the base conversation, identifying the specific points at which his skepticism had been not just wrong, but wrong in ways that a more careful observer would not have been. The shoulder drop he'd missed on Cerna for 6 weeks. The tone in her voice when she'd said, "Trust what you feel." The way she'd been at the bench with those wind charts before anyone else had thought to pull the forecast data. He had called it favoritism. He had called it connection. He had constructed out of a combination of experience and assumption a story about her that had been wrong at every structural level. And the worst part, the part that Aldridge, who was an honest man despite being a stubborn one, was now forcing himself to sit with, was that his wrongness had not been simple ignorance. It had been choice. He had chosen the explanation that fit his existing framework and defended it against the evidence that contradicted it, and that was a different kind of wrong. That was the kind of wrong that a person in his position, with his years and his authority, had an obligation to examine. He would not do this in public. It was not his style. But he would do it because he was the kind of man who, when he was wrong about something important, needed to account for it, even if only to himself. He walked back toward the group without speaking, and when Reyes glanced at him and opened her mouth, he shook his head once, and she closed it again. Osei, standing outside the formal perimeter, where she was technically not present, heard the tone from the confirmation system and the readout that followed, and she pressed her hand flat against her sternum, where the impact of the information was landing like a physical thing. She had not doubted Maya. She had asked the night before whether Maya was scared, and Maya had told her the truth, and Osei had understood from that conversation that Maya was someone who operated from a place so deep below ordinary confidence that the word confidence didn't quite apply. She had gone into the evaluation the way someone goes into something they have already survived once. Which meant, Osei realized now, that what had just happened at the range was not a triumph for Maya in the way it would be a triumph for most people. It was a confirmation. A public one, finally, after years of private certainty that nobody around her could see. She turned and walked back toward the main facility, and she was careful about her expression as she passed through the doors, because the feeling she was carrying was large enough that she didn't want to have to explain it to anyone she ran into. Hayes called his aide into the range command space after Walker finished documenting and said, "I need everything on the Redstone evaluation package updated before end of day." Full documentation of the confirmed shot atmospheric data included first-round confirmation noted prominently. "And I want a direct communication sent to the Personnel Records Office requesting a full declassification review of Sergeant Collins's file." Greer blinked. "Sir, a declassification request for a file at that access level would need to go through—" "I know what level it needs to go through. Send it to that level. Make clear it's coming from this command, and put my name on it." "Yes, sir. One more thing." Hayes paused. He turned the next sentence over for a moment before he said it because it was not a thing he said often, and he wanted to say it correctly. "Make sure the documentation reflects explicitly that Sergeant Collins was not provided. Spotter support was not provided a second attempt and achieved confirmation in a single round under live atmospheric conditions. I want that in the record, all of it." "Understood, sir." After Greer left, Hayes stood alone for a moment in the range command space. He thought about the night before lying awake, thinking about a 19-year-old alone in a position he couldn't picture. He thought about what it meant that the institution had sealed her record and left her to carry the number like a private marking that nobody was supposed to be able to read. He thought about the fact that he had been one of the people who hadn't been able to read it and what that had cost her, even in a small way, even in the specific small way of walking into a facility on her first morning and being met with suspicion instead of the baseline professional respect that her record, even the visible parts of it, should have commanded. He picked up his phone. There was a call he needed to make that was different from the 7 calls he'd made to personnel records. This one was to a number he had never expected to use for this particular purpose, a contact at a level of the military structure that he interacted with only on matters of genuine operational significance. He had used it for 3 things in 9 years of command. He considered this to be the 4th. The phone rang twice. A voice answered. "This is Hayes," he said. "I'm calling from Redstone Mountain. I need to talk to someone about a classified record and what's been done with it." There was a pause on the other end that was longer than he expected. Then the voice said, "We've been waiting for that call, General. Is Collins there?" Hayes stared at the wall. "She's on the range. Tell her Colonel Reed is on his way." The line went quiet. Hayes held the phone for a moment after it disconnected, absorbing the specific quality of that information. They had been waiting for this call, which meant this moment had been anticipated by someone at a level above his, which meant Maya Collins's assignment to Redstone Mountain had not been random, and the evaluation had not been simply a performance evaluation. He had been, without knowing it, part of something that had been set in motion before she walked through his door. He put the phone in his pocket and walked out of the range command space and back toward the firing line, where Maya was still standing, still present, waiting with the same patience she had used to wait for the 4-second wind window. Because she understood, he realized now that this part of the day was also a kind of waiting for a correct moment. "Sergeant Collins," he said. "There's a Colonel Reed incoming. Do you know that name?" Something crossed her face. Not surprise. Not relief. Something older and more complicated, the expression of someone hearing the name of a person who is connected to a part of their story they had not expected to be reached today. "Yes, sir," she said. "I know him. He said you should know he's coming." She nodded. She looked away for a moment toward the distance where the target was, where the round had gone, where the confirmation had come from, and her expression in that moment was something that Hayes was not sure he had words for, and where the confirmation had come from. And her expression in that moment was something that Hayes was not sure he had words for, and was not sure he was supposed to be seeing. It was private. It was the expression of someone for whom a very long thing was approaching its end. Then she looked back at him. "How long?" He didn't say. "Then I'll wait." "Maya." He used her first name without planning to. It came out before he could apply his usual command register filter, and he didn't try to correct it once it was out. "I want to say something to you, and I want to say it now, rather than after Reed gets here, because after he gets here, this becomes a different kind of conversation." She looked at him. "I made my assessment of you on the first morning," he said, "based on what I could see. And what I could see was insufficient. I made a judgment I wasn't equipped to make, and I've been operating from that judgment since you arrived, and I want to acknowledge that directly." She was very still. "You didn't need my belief in order to do what you just did," he said. "I know that. But I'm telling you anyway, because the not telling would mean something I don't want to carry." She looked at him for a long moment. The expression on her face was not the expression of someone who was accepting an apology. It was something subtler. The expression of someone who recognizes that a thing has been said genuinely and is deciding what to do with the weight of that. "Thank you, sir," she said. "It matters more than it would have 2 days ago." I understood what she meant. 2 days ago it would have been simple. Now it cost him something, which was the thing that made it real. Walker had come up beside them without either of them fully registering his arrival. "I've completed the formal documentation," he said. "It's going to command." He paused. "I've also submitted a personal addendum, off the formal record." Hayes looked at him. "What kind of addendum?" "The kind that says I've evaluated a lot of shooters," Walker said, "and that what I witnessed today is the best work I have ever seen under any conditions, controlled or uncontrolled, in 20 years. He looked at Maya. "I wanted that somewhere, even if the classification walls come back up." Aldridge had drifted close enough to hear this. He didn't say anything immediately. He stood with it for a moment, and then he did something that was not characteristic of him in public. He looked directly at Maya Collins and said, "I was wrong about you. I said things in the NCO mess that I'm not going to pretend I didn't say. I'm telling you directly that I was wrong, and I'm not going to qualify it." She looked at him. "Sergeant Aldridge." "Sergeant Collins. You noticed Cerna's shoulder drop after I pointed it out," she said. "You went back and fixed it. That's what matters." He stared at her. It was not the response he expected. It was, he realized, the response of someone who understood that acknowledgement was less useful than forward motion, and who had enough experience with the weight of other people's errors to have no interest in performing the ritual of accepting them. "Yeah," he said quietly. "All right." The rest of the morning unfolded in the particular way of military procedure, which is to say that the significance of what had happened began to be processed through the formal mechanisms that the institution provided for processing. Significant things, reports, documentation, communication chains. The careful language of official records that transforms extraordinary moments into standardized entries that can be filed and referenced, and eventually either released or sealed away again. Maya was asked to remain available. She remained available by sitting on a bench outside the range command space with her notebook open, working through the shot data, with the same methodical focus she brought to everything, extracting the variables that had contributed to the confirmed hit, and documenting them in the format she always used, because she had learned early in her training that the most important thing you could do after an extraordinary performance was understand it clearly enough to repeat it. Reyes walked past her twice without stopping. On the third pass, she stopped and said, "Can I ask you something?" Maya looked up. "Ask." "Did you know it was going to work?" The question was sincere and direct, and deserved the same in return. "I knew the conditions were correct," Maya said. "I knew my preparation was complete. I knew there wasn't a variable I hadn't accounted for." She paused. "Whether that means I knew, I'm not sure. I knew the work was right. The result is what the work produces." Reyes thought about this. "That's a very specific kind of faith." "It's not faith," Maya said. "It's calculation. Faith is when you don't have the data. I had the data." Reyes almost smiled. "Is there ever a moment when the data isn't enough?" Maya looked at her steadily. "Once," she said. "When I was 19. And I survived that too." Reyes walked away with that answer, and she turned it over in her mind for the rest of the morning, and she thought about what it must be like to be the person who had gotten through the moment when the data was insufficient and come out the other side with a number that nobody would believe and a record that nobody could see, and then gone on doing the work anyway, because the work was the only thing that had always been hers. Colonel Michael Reed arrived at Redstone Mountain at 1347. How was a compact man in his late 50s, the kind of man whose physical size was immediately at odds with the specific authority he projected, not the authority of rank, which was considerable, but the deeper authority of someone who had been involved in things that left a particular mark on a person. He had a face that had been weathered by years of decisions made under conditions that most people never encountered, and he moved through the base's receiving area with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been to many facilities and had no need to orient himself. Hayes met him at the entrance. They shook hands with the formality of men who held equivalent levels of institutional gravity and were aware of it. "General Hayes," Reed said, "I appreciate the speed." "I appreciate you coming personally," Hayes said. "I wasn't sure you would. I've been waiting for this particular call for a while." Reed looked around the facility. "Where is she?" "Range area. She wanted to be near the documentation process." Reed nodded. "Of course she did." He said it with the familiarity of someone who had known this person long enough to recognize her patterns. "I should tell you, General, her assignment here was not incidental. I requested her placement at Redstone." Hayes had suspected this. Hearing it confirmed still settled something uncomfortably in his chest. For what purpose? Reed looked at him with the directness of someone who had decided in the walk from the gate that this man had earned a straight answer. "Because she's been carrying something alone for 7 years, and she needed to do it in front of witnesses who would document it correctly. She needed the work to be seen. Not for her career. Her career is already something that most people in this building don't have clearance to know about. For her." He paused. "What I designed for her at 19 was necessary. What it cost her was something I didn't fully calculate. Sending her here was a partial accounting." Hayes was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "A partial accounting." "I'm aware it's insufficient," Reed said. "It's what I have to offer." They walked together toward the range area, and the conversation they had on the way was not the kind of conversation that Hayes expected to be having with a colonel he'd spoken to only twice before in his career. But the morning had already produced several things he hadn't expected, and he had adjusted his expectations accordingly. Maya saw Reed coming from 30 feet away. She stood up, closed the notebook, put it in her kit. She did not come to full attention. What she did was stand in a way that was somewhere between the posture of a soldier and the posture of a person who has a complicated history with the man walking toward them, respectful but not formal, present but not performing. Reed stopped in front of her. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Then Reed said, "First round." "Yes, sir." "Under live conditions." "Yes, sir." He looked at her with an expression that Hayes, watching from a few steps back, found difficult to categorize. It was not pride exactly, or not only pride. It was the look of someone who understood the full weight of a thing and was looking at the person who had been carrying it and trying to convey without the words being adequate that the weight had been witnessed. "I owe you an accounting," Reed said. "A real one, not just this." Maya looked at him for a long moment. "I know, sir." "Are you willing to have that conversation?" She said, "I've been willing for 7 years." The directness of it, not angry, not wounded, just factual, landed in the space between them, with the weight of everything that had been unsaid for 7 years, and Reed absorbed it with the stillness of someone who had anticipated it, and had decided before arriving that he would not deflect it. "Then let's have it," he said. Hayes took a single step back, understanding without being told that what was about to happen was not for him, not yet, not in this form. He turned and found Walker at his elbow. "Sir," Walker said quietly, "the documentation is filed." "Good. There's one more thing." Walker hesitated for a fraction of a second, unusual for him. "The number in her file, the entry after the classification block. I've been cleared to update it." Hayes turned to look at him. "Update it how?" "The original entry just had the number. No context, no designation, no mission reference." Walker looked toward Maya and Reed, who were now in a conversation that was too quiet to hear from where they stood. "They've authorized a formal record entry. Officially recognized. Documentation of everything. The distance, the conditions, the mission context, her age at the time, the fact that she acted alone." Hayes stared at him. "They authorized a declassification. Partial. Enough. Enough for the record to say what it should have said 7 years ago." Hayes turned back toward Maya, who was still talking to Reed. her posture unchanged, her voice still too quiet to reach him. He watched her for a moment. This woman who had walked into his weapons bay 6 days ago and picked up a Barrett like it belonged to her, who had told him the number meant what it looked like, who had waited 11 minutes without moving for a 4-second window in the wind. I thought about what Walker had just said. Enough for the record to say what it should have said 7 years ago. "Make sure it's right," Hayes said. "Every word." "Yes, sir," Walker said. "Every word." The conversation between Maya and Reed lasted 47 minutes. Hayes knew the duration because he tracked it without meaning to. The way you track the time when something important is happening nearby and you cannot be part of it. He stayed in the range command space with Walker reviewing the documentation. One final time, making sure every number was right, every timestamp accurate, every atmospheric variable correctly logged. It was necessary work, and it kept his hands occupied while his mind stayed half present in the space where Maya and Reed were talking. Walker finished the final review and closed the folder. "It's clean," he said. "Everything lines up." "Good." Hayes didn't look up immediately. "What do you know about Reed?" Walker considered the question. "Enough to know that his name attached to a classified record means the operation involved was at the highest tier of authorization. The kind of thing that doesn't go through normal channels. The kind where the people involved are selected so specifically that the selection itself is classified." "She was 19, Hayes said. Walker didn't respond to that directly. He said, "The people who get selected at that level aren't selected randomly. Whatever she was at 19, she was already." He paused, looking for the word. "Already what she is now. The training refines it. It doesn't create it." Hayes thought about that. He thought about the photograph in her chest pocket, the one he'd noticed during the evaluation. The slight rectangular outline under the left side of her jacket, sitting precisely over her heart. He had not asked about it. He was not going to ask about it. Some things a person carries in a place that was not meant to be examined. Outside, the conversation continued. What Hayes couldn't hear Reed was saying. He had started with the operational facts, which was his training, and his instinct lead, with what can be documented, because the documented things create the framework within which everything else can be understood. He told Maya what she already knew about the mission, the classification level, the reason for it, the decision that had been made at the top of a very short chain to restrict her record in the way it had been restricted. She listened without interrupting. She had heard most of this before in a debriefing room 7 years ago, when she was still 19 and still bleeding from a place that wasn't physical and hadn't fully understood that what she was being told was not the whole truth of what had happened to her. The restriction was applied because of the geopolitical sensitivity of the location, Reed said. Not because of anything you did wrong. I want to be clear about that. You were clear about it 7 years ago, she said. That part I always understood. Then what didn't you understand? She looked at him. I understood why you classified the mission. I understood why my record had to be sealed. What I didn't understand, what I still don't fully understand, is why nobody told me what happened to the people I was protecting. I never got confirmation. I never got told whether the decision I made at 19 years old alone with 3 seconds to choose actually did what I needed it to do. Reed was quiet. You put a number in my file, she said. 3,200 meters. You documented the distance. You didn't document the outcome. He absorbed this. The expression on his face was the expression of a man who has known something was owed for a long time and has arrived at the moment when the debt can no longer be deferred. They came home, he said. All 4 of them. She was very still. The decision you made gave them the time they needed to extract. All 4 of them made it to the secondary position and were recovered within 6 hours. He paused. I should have told you that 7 years ago. I didn't because the debrief protocol required limiting information disclosure to prevent the possibility of secondary exposure. I told myself the protocol was the reason. The honest accounting is that the protocol was convenient and I used it. Maya said nothing for a long moment. The silence had a quality to it, not empty, not hostile, but full in the way that silences are full, when the thing that needed to be said has finally been said, and the person receiving it needs time to let it settle into a body that has been carrying the absence of it for 7 years. 4, she said finally. Yes. All 4. All 4. She turned away from him briefly. Not to hide something, she was past hiding things in front of Reed, who had seen her at her most exposed, but because some responses need a direction to go that isn't into another person's face. She looked at the mountains. She breathed. She let the 7-year-old weight shift in a way it hadn't shifted since the day she first picked it up. Then she turned back. Why now? She said. Why tell me now? Because you proved it again, Reed said. In front of witnesses, under conditions that can be documented, and because... He stopped. Tried again. Because I've been watching what the secrecy cost you, not just the career dimensions, the other cost. And I realized that my accounting to you was incomplete. The number in your file wasn't enough. You needed to know what the number was for. She looked at him for a long time. Then she said, the declassification. Partial, enough to put the full record in place. The mission location stays sealed. The operational context stays sealed. But your achievement, what you did, how you did it, the fact that it was you and you were 19 and you were alone, that comes out of the classification block and goes into a form that can be read, that can be seen. By whom? By anyone with appropriate command-level clearance. By this base's personnel record system. By the evaluation documentation that Captain Walker filed this morning. He held her gaze. By you. On your own record. Where it should have been from the beginning. She said nothing. It's insufficient, he said. I know it's insufficient. 7 years is 7 years. What was done to your record and to your career trajectory is not something that a partial declassification fully corrects. I know that. Then why do it? Because it's what I have, he said. And because the alternative is leaving it the way it is, which I'm no longer willing to do. She looked at him with the steady, clear-eyed quality that Hayes had seen in her from the first morning, the quality of someone who had processed more than their share of difficult information and had developed the capacity to hold it without being deformed by it. Then she said, the 4 people. Do you have names? Reed reached into his jacket and produced a folded piece of paper. He held it out to her. She looked at it for a moment before she took it. Then she unfolded it and looked at the 4 names written there in Reed's handwriting, and she stood with those names for a long moment, the way you stand with the names of people whose survival is the reason a piece of your life costs what it costs. She folded the paper. She put it in her chest pocket next to the photograph. All right, she said. Tell me what comes next. What came next was a meeting in Hayes's command space that included Reed Walker, Maya, and Hayes himself, and it was the kind of meeting that military institutions hold when something has happened that requires the existing structure to expand in order to contain it. Reed presented the declassification parameters. Walker reviewed the documentation implications. Hayes asked specific questions about what the updated record would show and what it would not show, and he asked them with the precision of someone who had learned in the past 6 days that the difference between what a record shows and what actually happened can be vast and consequential. Maya sat through most of it without speaking. Not passively, she answered directly when addressed, confirmed details when asked, and twice corrected a technical element in the documentation that would have been inaccurate if left uncorrected. But she was not performing engagement. She was in the room the way she had been in every room since arriving at Redstone, present, functional. Carrying the specific weight of her own story, with the quiet endurance that was simply how she moved through the world. At one point Reed said, "There's a broader review that will follow from this. The classification policy around operational records for personnel below officer grade is going to be examined. Your case isn't the only one." Hayes looked up sharply. "There are others like this. Not identical. But the pattern: enlisted personnel performing at an extraordinary level in classified contexts, and then having the record sealed in ways that damage their career visibility and advancement. Yes, it's not rare enough." Hayes absorbed this. Something moved in his expression. Not surprise exactly, because he was not a naive man, and he understood how institutions operated. But a specific kind of controlled anger that comes from having the thing you suspected confirmed out loud, in a room where something could be done about it. "What's the review process?" he asked. "It goes through the Inspector General's office," Reed said. "A formal inquiry. It will take time. These things always take time. But the inquiry has been authorized at a level that makes it difficult to stall, and I intend to be present throughout it. I'd like to submit this base's documentation as part of the inquiry record," Hayes said. "That was my intention," Reed said. "With your permission." "You have it." Walker looked at Maya. She was writing in her notebook again, and he felt watching her a kind of emotion that he recognized as specific to encounters with people whose quality far exceeded the context in which you found them, a mixture of respect and something closer to grief for the circumstances that had required that quality to be demonstrated in a way that was this costly. "Collins," he said. She looked up. "When the inquiry runs, they're going to want your account. Personal testimony about the classification and its impact." She nodded slowly. "I know." "Are you willing?" She looked at him with an expression that was not complicated, it was simply decided. "I've been willing to tell the truth for 7 years, she said. "The only thing that changed is that now someone is finally willing to hear it." Walker looked at Reed. Reed looked at Hayes. Hayes looked at the table for a moment and then said, "Let's make sure we do this right." The base did not return to normal after that meeting, because normal was no longer the accurate description of where Redstone Mountain was. The evaluation documentation had moved through the formal communication channels with the speed that significant results always moved, which was faster than most routine paperwork, and slower than the word of mouth had already traveled. By late afternoon, the essential facts were in circulation among the senior NCOs and officer corps, confirmed first-round hit. 200 meters, single shooter, no spotter, live atmospheric conditions. And those facts were doing what extraordinary facts do in a closed community. They were reorienting the internal landscape. Aldridge called a session with his advanced shooters that evening. He didn't open it by discussing Maya Collins directly. He opened it the way he always opened sessions, with a technical review, and then partway through he stopped and said, "I want to talk to you about something outside the technical, about how we form assessments of other shooters." The 8 soldiers in the room looked at him. "I made an assessment this week," he said, "based on experience and pattern recognition and the kind of confidence that comes from doing this job for a long time. That assessment was wrong. Not partially wrong, structurally wrong. And I want to explain why, not to publicly embarrass myself, but because the mechanism by which I was wrong is something that I don't want any of you to replicate when you're in a position to make those judgments." He walked them through it. Not Maya's name, not the specific details, but the anatomy of the bias, the way he had defaulted to an explanation that fit his expectations rather than interrogating his expectations themselves. The way experience, which is supposed to make you more accurate, had in this case made him more defended against information that contradicted his existing model. The way he had used legitimate technical knowledge as armor against having to update what he thought he knew. It was one of the best sessions his advanced shooters had ever had. Not because of the technical content. Because of what it modeled, what it looked like when someone with genuine authority chose honesty over self-protection. Private Cerna, sitting in the front row, thought about the session where a sergeant he'd never met had identified his shoulder drop in 30 seconds, and never mentioned it to him directly, letting Aldridge deliver the correction in the way that would land cleanest. He thought about the result of that, his best shot of the year, and he thought about what it meant that the person who had seen his problem most clearly had cared enough about the outcome to make the fix happen in the most effective way, not the most visible way. I didn't say anything in the session, but afterward he found Aldridge and said, "Sergeant, that thing you said about being wrong, I think I've done the same thing. About several people." Aldridge looked at him. "Then fix it." "How?" "Same way I'm doing it. You say it directly to the person, and then you don't qualify it, and then you move forward and do better work." Cerna nodded. "Yes, Sergeant." I went back to his bunk and wrote 3 names in a notebook. 3 people he owed a direct and unqualified correction to. He would find them in the morning. Hayes spent the evening doing something he almost never did, which was sitting with the door of his office open and not working. He sat at his desk with nothing in front of him, and let the day move through his mind in the way that significant days sometimes needed to be processed, not analyzed, not documented, just moved through, allowed to settle into the parts of a person where experience accumulates and eventually becomes something that changes how you see. He thought about Reed's phrase, a partial accounting. He thought about the fact that Reed had arranged Maya's placement at Redstone specifically so that the work could be seen, and that the mechanism for being seen had been an evaluation that Hayes himself had ordered, which meant that Hayes had, without knowing it, been part of Reed's accounting. He had been the witness. The documentation that Walker had filed with his name on it as commanding officer would become part of the inquiry record. His voice, his command authority, his insistence that the paperwork reflect every specific detail of what had happened on the range, those things would go into the formal structure that was now working toward correcting something that had been wrong for 7 years. He had been used without being asked. He found that he did not object to it because the purpose was right and the result was right, and he was honest enough with himself to acknowledge that if Reed had approached him at the beginning and explained what he was doing, Hayes might have introduced complications out of institutional caution that would have slowed or muddied something that needed to be clean. Still, he picked up his phone and called Reed's room. Reed answered on the second ring. "You could have told me," Hayes said. Not accusatory, just direct. Reed was quiet for a moment. "Would you have run the evaluation differently if you'd known?" Hayes thought about it honestly. "Probably not." "Then the outcome is the same." "The outcome is the same," Hayes agreed. "That's not the point." "No," Reed said. "You're right, it's not." He paused. "I made the same calculation about information disclosure that I made 7 years ago. I told myself the protocol required it. The honest answer is that I'm still learning when the protocol is right and when it's convenient." Hayes absorbed this. She said something similar, about the difference between understanding why and knowing the outcome. "She's been thinking about this longer than either of us." "Yes," Hayes said. "She has." There was a pause that was not uncomfortable. The pause of two men who have had a hard day and are sitting with it from opposite sides of the same event. "The IG review," Hayes said. "How long?" 6 months minimum, probably closer to a year. "I'll keep the documentation current on this end." "I know you will," Reed said. "That's why I chose Redstone." Hayes was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Get some sleep, Colonel." "You too, General." He hung up. He sat for a while longer in the open office. Down the corridor, the base moved through its evening rhythms, the shift change, the dinner rotation, the small sounds of an institution maintaining itself through the night. Ordinary sounds, the sounds that had surrounded every extraordinary thing that had happened in the past 6 days. He thought about his daughter in Seattle. He thought about a conversation he'd been meaning to have with her for approximately 3 years, about a thing she'd said at a family dinner that he'd deflected at the time because he hadn't been ready to engage with it honestly. He thought that the honest conversation that was necessary was actually not as complicated as he'd been making it, and that the complication had been a kind of protocol he'd been hiding behind. I made a note to call her in the morning. Maya didn't know any of this was happening. She was in the small room she used for quiet work, and she had the piece of paper with 4 names open on the table in front of her, and she was sitting with those 4 names the way she had always needed to sit with them, not reading them over and over, just holding them in her field of vision and allowing what they represented to be real in a way that 7 years of uncertainty had prevented. 4 people. All 4. She had made the decision in 3 seconds. 3 seconds was all she'd had. 3 seconds between the moment she recognized the situation and the moment the situation would have resolved itself without her if she hadn't acted. She had been trained for decisions that happened in compressed time. She had been trained for the psychology of them, for the way the brain processes extreme pressure, for the way experience creates pathways that allow action to precede conscious thought. When conscious thought is too slow to be useful. She had been prepared. She had not been prepared for the afterward. The afterward was what no training fully reached, the way a decision made in 3 seconds could occupy the next 7 years. The way you could know intellectually that you had done the right thing and still lie awake at 3 a.m., doing the arithmetic of it, counting what it had cost and not knowing what it had bought, because the buying happened somewhere you couldn't see. 4 names. All 4 came home. She placed her palm flat on the paper. Not a gesture anyone would have assigned significance to if they'd seen it just a hand on a page. But for Maya Collins, it was the physical equivalent of a thing she had needed to say for 7 years and hadn't had the information to say it was enough. What you did was enough. The 3 seconds were worth what they cost. She sat with her hand on the paper for a long time. Then she picked up her pen and opened her notebook and wrote the 4 names across the top of a clean page, and beneath them she began to write. Not about the mission, not about the shot, but about what it had felt like to carry an unknown outcome for 7 years, and what it felt like now that the outcome was known. She wrote for almost an hour, the way people write, when they have been keeping something in a small internal space, and the space has finally been expanded enough to let it fully out. She didn't know if she would ever share what she wrote. It didn't matter. The writing was for her in the same way the shot had always been for her. Not for the audience, not for the record, not for the number in the file. For the thing inside her that needed to complete a circuit that had been open for 7 years. When she finished writing, she looked at the page for a moment. Then she closed the notebook. The circuit closed. Osei found her in this common area an hour later. Both of them gravitating to the same quiet space at the same hour for their own separate reasons. And Osei made coffee, the base coffee that was mediocre and reliable, and set a cup on the table next to Maya without asking. Maya looked at the cup, then at Osei. Thanks. Osei sat down across from her. She didn't ask about the evaluation, or the confirmation, or read, or any of the things that had moved through the base's conversation all day. She had heard it all in the way everyone on the base had heard it all through the osmosis of information that was the defining feature of a closed community. She didn't need to make it the subject of another conversation. She said, "Did you sleep last night?" Maya almost smiled. It was a small expression quickly controlled, but it was real. Enough. And tonight? Probably more. Osei nodded. She drank her coffee. The comfortable silence that follows between 2 people who have already said something real to each other and don't need to fill every gap settled in, and Maya sat inside it without resistance, which was unusual for her. She was generally a person for whom stillness was productive, oriented toward the next problem. This stillness was different. This was the stillness of someone who had finished something. "Private Osei," she said after a while. "Sergeant Collins. What made you sign up for observation duty yesterday? You weren't on the cleared list initially." Osei considered the question honestly. "I wanted to be there," she said. "I didn't have a better reason than that. I just felt like it mattered that someone who believed you was in the room." Maya looked at her for a long moment. "It did matter. You knew I was there. I knew someone was standing at the perimeter who wasn't supposed to be there," Maya said. "I could hear the different position. I assumed it was someone curious enough to push the line a little." Osei laughed a short, genuine sound. "I thought I was being subtle." "You were fine," Maya said. "You were just outside. I could tell the difference between the cleared personnel and someone standing at the edge by the way the sound moved." She paused. It helped. Having someone at the edge. Osei held that. It was a small thing, and also not a small thing. "I'm glad," she said. They finished their coffee in silence, and the silence was the comfortable kind, and the hour was late, and the base moved through its night rhythms around them, and tomorrow would arrive with its own requirements, as tomorrow always did. Reed came to find Hayes one more time before the lights-out hour, and Hayes was still in his office, and the door was still open, and Reed stood in the doorway for a moment before Hayes looked up. "There's something I didn't say in the meeting," Reed said. Hayes gestured toward the chair across from his desk. Reed came in and sat. He had the posture of someone who has been carrying a specific piece of information through an entire day and has decided that the day cannot end without it being placed somewhere outside himself. "When I selected her," Reed said, "at 19, there was a review process, extensive. The selection criteria at that level are," he paused, "specific. We looked at performance data, training records, psychological profiles, stress response metrics. Everything that can be measured, we measured. And her numbers were exceptional across every category. I selected her because the numbers said she was the right person for that assignment. Hayes waited. What I didn't fully account for, Reed said, was that numbers are not a person, and what I was sending into that situation was a person, 19 years old, and the numbers didn't tell me what carrying that decision alone would cost her in the years afterward, because that's not something numbers can measure. He looked at Hayes steadily. I've made that calculation error more than once. I'm telling you this because you're going to be making these calculations in your command, and I think... He stopped. I think you're the kind of officer who would want to know that the metric that gets missed is always the person. Hayes sat with this for a long moment. The metric that gets missed is always the person, he repeated. Is that from something? It's from watching what happens when you don't account for it, Reed said. Hayes nodded slowly. I'll remember that. Reed stood. I fly out at 0600. I'll be in contact as the inquiry moves forward. I'll have the documentation ready. Reed moved toward the door. Then he stopped and said without turning around, She's going to be all right, you know. She's been all right. I just needed to make sure I hadn't left a debt unpaid. Is it paid? Hayes asked. Reed turned slightly. Getting there. He left. Hayes sat alone for another few minutes in the open office with the corridor sounds of the base at night moving past his door, and he thought about what Reed had said. The metric that gets missed is always the person, and he thought about how many decisions he had made in 31 years, where he had trusted the numbers and not fully accounted for what the numbers couldn't hold. I thought about how you changed that. Not programmatically, not procedurally, but in the specific daily choices of how you looked at the people in front of you. Whether you looked at them long enough to see past the rank and the record to the thing the record could not contain. He thought about a young sergeant who had walked into his weapons bay and picked up a Barrett like it belonged to her. He thought about how he had looked at her in that first moment and seen a problem to be managed. He thought about what she had actually been from the first second if he had known how to look. He closed his office door. He picked up the phone and sent a text to his daughter in Seattle. Not the full conversation, it was too late for that, and the phone was the wrong medium. But the beginning of it. 3 sentences that opened the door that he'd been keeping closed for 3 years. She responded in less than 2 minutes. He stared at her response for a moment, and then he did something that no aide or colleague of his had seen him do in a very long time. He smiled. It was small and quiet, and completely genuine. The smile of someone who has had a hard day and found at the end of it one more thing that needed to be made right, and discovered that it was not too late to make it. He put down the phone. I had a full day tomorrow. The documentation, the inquiry preparation, the communication chains, that the evaluation results had opened the administration of a base that continued to require administration regardless of what had happened on the range. He had all of that waiting for him at 0600. Tonight, for the first time in 6 days, he would sleep without the weight of an unresolved question sitting in his chest. The question had been resolved. It had been resolved at 200 meters in 4 seconds by a woman who had been doing this work since she was 19 years old and carrying the weight of it alone since before he had ever heard her name. He owed her more than he could give. He understood that. But he would give what he had, and he would make sure the record said what it needed to say, and he would be present for the inquiry, and he would not let protocol become convenient again. It was insufficient. It was what he had. He turned off the desk lamp and walked to the door and stopped there for a moment in the threshold, looking back at the empty office, and then he walked out and down the corridor and was gone. Reed left at 0600, the way he said he would, and the base felt his departure as a shift in air pressure, not his absence exactly, but the closing of the particular chapter his presence had represented. He had come with the weight of a 7-year debt, and he had left with it reduced, not eliminated, but reduced in the way that honest accounting reduces things, even when it cannot fully settle them. Maya was awake when his vehicle moved through the gate. She heard it from the small room where she had been sitting since 5, not working. Just sitting, which was unusual enough for her that she noticed it herself. She was not a person who sat without purpose. But the morning after the conversation with Reed, and the evening with the 4 names, and the hour with Osei, And the writing that had finished something the morning after all of that had a quality of open space that she hadn't known in a long time, and she was not yet sure what to do with open space, so she sat inside it and let it be what it was. The photograph was on the table in front of her. She had taken it out of her jacket pocket sometime in the night and set it down, which she had never done before. It had always lived in the pocket present, but unseen the way certain things need to be carried. Now it was face up on the table, and she was looking at it in the early morning light, and what she saw was what she always saw. 4 faces in a debrief room taken by someone she couldn't remember with a camera. She hadn't known was there, 7 years old and slightly overexposed, the 4 people looking at the lens with the specific expression of people who have just come through something and are not yet fully sure they are through it. She knew their names now. Reed had given them to her on a folded piece of paper, and she had put the paper in the pocket beside the photograph, and they were together now, the faces and the names complete in the way that things are complete when the missing piece finally arrives. She put the photograph back in her jacket pocket. She got up. She had work to do. The work that morning was not on the range. Walker had sent her a message the previous evening asking her to come to the documentation office at 0800, and when she arrived, he was already there with a tablet and 2 printed copies of the formal evaluation report, and he slid one across the table to her without preamble. "Read it," he said. "Tell me if anything is wrong." She read it. It took 11 minutes because she read carefully the way she did everything, not hurrying past the sections that were straightforward in order to get to the sections that mattered, but giving each part the attention it required. Walker drank his coffee and waited, and did not rush her. When she finished, she set it down. "The atmospheric log on page 4, she said. "The wind shear designation at the 1500-meter marker is listed as south-southwest. It was south-southeast. The difference matters for the trajectory calculation." Walker pulled the tablet and checked the raw data. He was quiet for a moment. Then he made the correction without speaking. "Anything else?" he asked. "The 11-minute hold time before the shot. It's listed as part of the standard pre-fire procedure. It wasn't standard. It was a read-dependent hold. The distinction matters for anyone who uses this evaluation as a benchmark." "How should it be described?" She thought for a moment. "Atmospheric condition-dependent pre-fire hold duration determined by real-time wind layer monitoring and cross-referenced against pre-calculated trajectory windows. That's accurate." Walker typed it. He read it back. She nodded. "Anything else?" "No," she said. "The rest is accurate." He submitted the final version while she watched, and when the system confirmed the submission, he looked up at her. "That document is now part of the permanent evaluation record for this base. It will be referenced in the IG inquiry. It will be part of your formal record update." He paused. "How does that feel?" She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, rather than deflecting it. "Like something that should have existed for a long time," she said. "And like it doesn't change the 7 years it didn't exist. Both of those things at the same time. That's honest. It's the only thing I know how to be." Walker closed the tablet. He looked at her in the way he'd been looking at her since the first morning he'd found her with the wind charts, with the particular respect of someone who has recognized a thing they cannot fully articulate, and has decided that the articulation is less important than the recognition. "What happens to you next?" he asked. "After Redstone." She looked at him steadily. "There's another assignment." "Can you tell me what it is?" "No, sir." He nodded, unsurprised. "Is it the kind of assignment you want?" She was quiet for a moment. It was not a question she was often asked. Most of her career had been structured around the kind of assignments that were given, rather than chosen, where the relevant question was not what she wanted, but what the mission required. The idea that the two things might align, that she might move towards something that was both necessary and chosen, was still new enough to feel slightly unfamiliar. "I think so," she said. "Yes." "Good." He stood and extended his hand across the table. Not a salute, a handshake person to person, the kind of gesture that crosses the gradient of rank, when two people have shared something significant enough that rank becomes temporarily beside the point. She took his hand and shook it and let it mean what it meant. Captain Walker, she said. Sergeant Collins. He almost smiled. It was a privilege to document what I saw. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she picked up her copy of the evaluation report, folded it once, and put it in the same pocket as the photograph and the 4 names. She walked out. She found Aldridge at the range. He was alone, running his own qualification sequence, the kind of methodical self-assessment that experienced instructors do periodically to make sure they have not allowed the teaching to replace the doing. He saw her coming and did not stop what he was doing, which she respected a shooter. Mid-sequence should not stop mid-sequence. She waited. He finished the series, logged the results, and turned to her. Collins. Aldridge. He looked at her for a moment with the directness that had been his consistent quality, even when that directness had been pointed in the wrong direction. You're leaving soon. It wasn't a question. Word moved at the speed it always moved. Tomorrow morning, she said. He nodded. He seemed to be deciding something, and then he said, I want to show you something. He handed her a printed sheet, the results from his morning sequence, laid out in the tabular format the range system generated. She scanned it. He was good. Genuinely good, not in the way that someone who has taught for 6 years coasts on competence, but in the way that someone who has continued to work at the craft alongside the teaching maintains a real edge. His groupings were tight, and his consistency across the series was the kind that speaks to deeply embedded mechanics. Why are you showing me this? She asked. Because I spent 3 days talking about what you couldn't do, he said. And I never once asked what I could learn from what you could do. I'm asking now. I know you're leaving tomorrow. I know you can't stay long enough to work with my shooters directly. But you've been here a week, and you saw Cerna's problem in 30 seconds. I'd like to know what you see when you look at that sheet. She looked at it again more carefully. He waited. Your wind call timing, she said. You're making the call at peak exhale, which is standard. But at the distances you work at regularly, 12 to 1400 meters, the time between your call and your fire is putting you consistently 2 to 3 milliseconds outside your optimal window. It's not showing up significantly in your groupings because the margins at 1400 absorb it. But if you push the distance, the compounding effect becomes visible. He stared at her. You can read that from this sheet. Yes. Without watching me shoot. The consistency pattern in the groupings tells me where in the breath cycle you're firing. The drift in the left cluster at the far targets tells me the timing offset. She handed it back. It's not a flaw, it's a habit. Habits at that distance are manageable. At longer distances, they cost you. Aldridge looked at the sheet in his hand with new eyes. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said something that was not easy for a man with his pride and his years to say, and he said it without cushioning it or qualifying it. I should have watched instead of talked. You weren't wrong about the physics, she said. You were right about almost everything you said about the margins and the difficulty. You were just missing one variable. Which variable? She looked at him. The person who had already done it. He absorbed this. It landed the way truth lands when it's been delivered without malice, cleanly directly into the part of a person that is capable of accepting it. If you ever come back through Redstone, he said, I'd like you to spend a week with my advanced group. If I come back through, she said, I will. She turned to go. Then she stopped and said without turning around, Cerna has the best instincts of your 8. The technical corrections are almost complete. What he needs now is to stop asking for confirmation before he fires. He knows when the shot is right. He needs to trust that he knows. She walked away. Aldridge looked after her for a moment, and then he looked at the sheet in his hand, and then he went back to the range, and he spent the rest of the morning working on his wind call timing with a focus and a humility that he had not brought to his own practice in a while. Osei found out. Maya was leaving through the same channel. Everything else had traveled the base's reliable unofficial network, and she made her peace with it in the way that people make peace with things they knew were temporary, by having known it was temporary from the beginning, and by deciding that temporary was not the same as unimportant. She was in the common area when Maya came through after her session with Aldridge, and their eyes met the way they had met on that first day, when neither of them had yet spoken, and both of them had recognized something in the other without being able to name it. "Tomorrow," Osei said. 0630, Maya said. Osei nodded. She made a coffee, the same mediocre, reliable base coffee, and they sat at the table that had become their table over the course of a week, and Osei said, "Did it go the way you expected this week?" Maya thought about it genuinely. "No," she said. "I expected the evaluation to be the most significant part. It turned out to be the least significant part." Osei looked at her. "What was the most significant part?" "Knowing," Maya said. "About the 4 names. That was the most significant part." Osei did not ask what she meant by the 4 names, because she understood from the quality of Maya's voice when she said it that it was something carried over from a long way back, and that the understanding of it was its own complete thing that didn't need to be opened up and explained. "Good," she said simply. "I'm glad you know." Maya looked at her across the table, this young soldier with her direct questions, and her instinct not to press past what was offered, and her willingness to stand at the edge of a perimeter that was not her perimeter, because she felt like someone who believed should be in the room. "You're going to be good at this," Maya said. Osei looked at her. "At what specifically?" "At being someone people can tell the truth to. That's rarer than most of the things that get trained and measured and put in a file." She paused. "Don't let anyone manage it out of you." Osei held that. It was the most personal thing Maya had said to her across the entire week of conversations, and it landed with the weight of something that had been considered before it was offered. "I won't," she said. Maya stood. She picked up her cup, drank the last of the coffee, set it down. "Get some sleep, Private Osei." "You too, Sergeant Collins." She walked out. Osei sat at the table for a while after she was gone, with the weight of the week settling around her, and she thought about the things she had watched, and the things she had heard, and the specific quality of being in proximity to someone who had been through something defining and come out of it, not hardened, but deepened. She thought about what it meant to carry something alone for 7 years and still show up, still do the work, still treat the person in front of you with honesty and care, even when the institution around you had not done the same. She opened her notebook. She wrote for 20 minutes. She didn't know yet what she was writing toward, whether it was a record for herself, or the beginning of something she would eventually use, or simply the act of putting words around an experience, so that the experience didn't dissolve back into time and become just another week at a base where something unusual had happened. Whatever it was, she wrote it. Hayes did not know Maya was leaving until his aide mentioned it at the morning briefing, not as significant news, just as part of the day's personnel movements, and something shifted in his chest when he heard it, a specific tightening that he recognized as the feeling of a conversation that needed to happen before a window closed. He finished the briefing. He went to find her. She was in the weapons bay, which was where she had been on the first morning, and the symmetry of it was not lost on either of them when he walked through the door and found her standing in almost exactly the same position at the bench, the Barrett in front of her, though this time she was not handling it. She was standing beside it with her hands at her sides, and when she heard him come in, she turned, and there was something in her expression that was different from every previous expression he had seen on her face. It was open. Not unguarded, she was never entirely unguarded, but open in the way that people are open when they have resolved the internal conflict that has been keeping them defended. He walked toward her. He stopped a few feet away, which was closer than the formal distance his rank typically required him to maintain with enlisted personnel, and he did not adjust it because the formal distance felt wrong for what he needed to say. "You're leaving at 0630, he said. "Yes, sir." "I wanted to talk to you before you went." She waited. Hayes was a man who chose his words precisely, who had learned over 31 years that the words a leader used in significant moments had a weight that outlasted the moment itself. He had composed and discarded 3 versions of what he wanted to say before he found the one that was actually true. "When you walked in here a week ago," he said, "I saw a problem, a young sergeant who had overstepped, a record I couldn't read, a number I couldn't believe." He paused. "I spent the first 2 days of your time here working from that assessment. And the assessment was wrong, and I was the one who made it. And that means the way those 2 days felt for you is something I carry responsibility for." "Sir," Let me finish. He said it gently but clearly. I'm not asking you to release me from it. I'm telling you that I understand what it cost. Walking in somewhere new and being met with suspicion, instead of a fair read that has a specific cost, and the cost doesn't disappear because the outcome was eventually corrected. You carried that on top of everything else you were already carrying. He held her gaze. I am sorry for my part in it. Not as a formality. As the specific person who made the specific choices that added to your load. She looked at him for a long moment. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of someone receiving something they had not asked for and did not need in order to function, but that nonetheless mattered in a way she had not fully anticipated. General Hayes, she said, you were the one who said yes to the evaluation. You were the one who told Greer to make sure the documentation reflected every specific detail. You were the one who put your name on the inquiry submission. She paused. The first 2 days were what they were. What came after was also what it was. I hold both. He absorbed this. That's more grace than I earned. It's not grace, she said. It's accuracy. Both things happened. I'm not going to flatten it in either direction. He almost smiled at that. It was so precisely her, the refusal to simplify the insistence on holding the full complexity of a thing, rather than resolving it into a story that was easier to carry. No, he said. I suppose you wouldn't. Suppose you. He reached into his jacket and produced a folded document. This is a copy of the declassification notice, the updated record entry. Your name, the confirmed distance, the operational context summary, your age at the time, the single shooter confirmation. He held it out. It's yours. The original is in the system. This is for you to have physically. She took it. She looked at it for a moment without opening it. Then she folded it once and put it in her jacket pocket with the photograph and the 4 names and the evaluation report. And her pocket held more of her history in that moment than any single pocket had a right to contain. One more thing, Hayes said. She looked up. The inquiry. When they call for your testimony, and they will call for it, I'll make sure of that. I want you to tell them everything. Not just the classification and its impact on your record. The human cost of it. The 7 years of not knowing. The weight of carrying a decision at 19 that you couldn't verify. All of it. He was very direct. The people who design these policies need to hear that from the person who lived inside it. Not from Reed. Not from me. From you. She looked at him with an expression that combined directness and something warmer. I've been willing to tell the truth for 7 years. She said the same words she had said to Walker, because they were still true, because they had always been true. I'll be willing then too. He nodded. He extended his hand the same way Walker had across the gradient of rank person to person. She shook it. Sergeant Collins, he said. General Hayes. He turned and walked out. She stayed at the bench for a moment after he was gone, with her hand resting lightly on the edge of the table, and she let the week exist inside her as a complete thing, not resolved, not corrected, not simple, but complete. The number in her file had always been hers. Now the record was hers too. She packed in 15 minutes. There was not much. She had never been a person who accumulated things because accumulated things were weight, and weight slowed movement, and she had always been oriented toward the next position rather than the settled one. The notebook, the kit, the jacket with the pocket that held everything that mattered. That was it. She walked out of the small room at 0615 and moved through the corridor toward the exit, and at the junction, she stopped for one moment, just one, not long enough to be hesitation, but long enough to be deliberate, and she looked back down the corridor toward the weapons bay, toward the range command space, toward the direction of the mountain, where the shot had traveled and arrived, and confirmed something that had been true for 7 years, and was now true in a form that could be read. Then she turned and walked out. The morning was the mountain kind, cold and high, and pressing down low, the kind of cold she had come to associate with altitude work, the kind that made everything feel sharp and specific. She stood beside the vehicle that would take her to transport, and she looked at the base around her with the particular clear-eyed attention she brought to any environment she was about to leave. Osei was standing 20 feet away. She had not been told the exact departure time. She had calculated it from the Yo 630 information and arrived at Yo 615, which was the same calculation Maya would have made. They looked at each other across the gap. Maya nodded once. Osei nodded once. No words. They had said what needed to be said the night before, and this was the closing of it, and both of them understood that the closing did not require sound. She got in the vehicle. It moved through the gate. She did not look back. Not because the week hadn't mattered. It had mattered enormously in ways she was still processing, and would continue to process long after the altitude dropped and the mountain was behind her. But she had learned early in her training that looking back while moving forward was a specific inefficiency, and she was not an inefficient person. She looked ahead. The road descended through the mountains in long curves, each one opening a wider view, the kind of widening view that happens when you descend from a high place, and the horizon keeps expanding until the world is larger than it was from the position you held. She sat in the back of the vehicle and felt the descent and let the widening happen. She opened her notebook. She did not write about the shot, or the evaluation, or Reed, or Hayes, or the 4 names on the folded piece of paper in her pocket. She wrote about the next assignment, the thing she was moving toward, the specific technical parameters she needed to develop, further the variables she had identified during the Redstone evaluation that she wanted to incorporate into her preparation for whatever came next. She wrote the way she always wrote, methodically, functionally oriented toward the work. But underneath the methodology, running alongside it, like a current below the surface of a moving body of water, was something that had not been there before this week. It was not peace exactly. She was not a person for whom peace was a realistic, steady state, because the work she did was not peaceful work, and the life she had built was not built for peace. It was something more precise than peace. It was the feeling of a circuit that had been open for 7 years and was now closed. The decision she had made at 19 in 3 seconds alone, in a position she couldn't name, in a location she couldn't name, that decision was now whole. It had an outcome she could hold. The weight didn't disappear, but it had changed shape. It had become something she could carry forward rather than something that pulled her backward, and that was a different kind of weight entirely. She wrote for 40 minutes. Then she closed the notebook and sat in the silence of the descending road and thought about nothing specific, which was its own form of preparation, and let the vehicle carry her toward whatever came next. 3 weeks later, the formal IG inquiry opened. The notification came to Hayes's desk on a Tuesday morning, routed through the standard communication channels with the careful language that institutional reviews always used, preliminary inquiry scope and parameters enclosed. Request for documentation, anticipated timeline. He read it twice, then called Greer in and told him to pull the complete Redstone evaluation package, the atmospheric data walker's addendum, the declassification documentation, and the command submission he had signed and sent to Reed's level 3 weeks ago. All of it, Greer asked. Every page, Hayes said. And I want it organized chronologically, not by category. I want anyone reading it to see the sequence of events in the order they happened. He thought while Greer assembled the package about Reed's phrase, a partial accounting. He thought about the fact that the inquiry was Reed's larger accounting, the institutional version of the conversation Reed had driven 4 hours to have with Maya Collins in person. He thought about the other records that would be examined, the other personnel whose files had walls in them, like the wall in Maya's file, the other numbers sitting in classification blocks that nobody with the right frame of reference had thought to look at. He thought about what Walker had said enough for the record to say what it should have said 7 years ago. He signed the documentation submission and sent it that afternoon. Walker submitted his personal addendum to the inquiry the same day without being asked because he had composed it 3 weeks ago and had been waiting only for the formal channel to open. It was 2 pages long, and it contained technical specifics, and it contained personal testimony, and the personal testimony section ended with a sentence that Reed, when he read it 3 days later, sat with for a long time. What I witnessed on that range was not simply an exceptional performance. It was the completion of a record that should never have been made incomplete. Aldridge sent a letter. He had not been asked to send a letter, and a letter was not the standard format for inquiry submissions, but he sent it anyway. addressed to the inquiry officer typed on plain paper with no military formatting and no formal language. It said what he had seen in the session where he had missed Cerna's shoulder drop for 6 weeks, and she had named it in 30 seconds. It said what he had seen in the 11 minutes she had lain motionless on the firing line, waiting for a 4-second window. It said what he had said to his advanced shooters in the session that evening about the mechanism of being wrong and the obligation that came with recognizing it. He submitted it because the truth of a thing is built from multiple angles, and he had an angle, and he was no longer the kind of person who would withhold it because the formal channel seemed closed to it. The inquiry officer accepted it into the record. Osei wrote her own account, which she did not submit to the inquiry because she was not in a position to submit and had not been asked. She wrote it for herself in the notebook where she had been writing since the night of the evaluation, and she wrote it in the way that young people write about things that have changed them fully, honestly, with the particular intensity of someone for whom the event is still recent and vivid. She wrote about this question she had asked the night before the evaluation. "Are you scared?" and the answer she had received, and what the answer had opened in her understanding of what it meant to know something so deeply that fear stopped being the relevant variable. She wrote about what it meant to be the person who believed, not the person who doubted and then revised, not the person who documented and formalized, the person who before any evidence was confirmed, before any shot was fired, before any number was verified by any system, had simply looked at another person and understood what was there. She did not know yet what she was going to do with that understanding. She was 23, and she had a great deal of road ahead of her, and she was smart enough to know that the understanding would evolve as she did. But she wrote it down so she would have it from the beginning in its earliest form, before time did what time does to the sharpest edges of a thing. She closed the notebook. She put it in her kit. She went back to work. The inquiry ran for 8 months. At the end of it, 11 records were updated. 3 personnel at Hayes's level submitted formal letters of accountability for classification decisions made under their commands. 2 policy modifications were proposed to the Personnel Records Oversight Committee, addressing the restriction protocols applied to enlisted grade operational records in classified contexts. The modifications were accepted. Reed testified for 4 hours. Maya testified for 2. Her testimony was entered into the record in full, which meant that the words she had been willing to say for 7 years were now part of the formal institutional archive available to anyone with appropriate clearance, permanent in the way that formal records are permanent, not unchangeable, but entered into the structure of a thing that would persist beyond the people who created it. When her testimony was complete, the inquiry officer, a colonel named Vasquez, whom Maya had not met before that day, looked at her across the table and said simply, "Thank you, Sergeant Collins. This record is better for what you've added to it." Maya looked at her steadily. "It's accurate," she said. "That's all I ever needed it to be." She walked out of the testimony room and down a corridor and out of a building into the particular quality of morning light that exists after something has been completed, and she stood in that light for exactly the amount of time she needed to stand in it, which was not very long because she had a next assignment and a next position and a next set of technical variables to account for, and she was above all things, and after all years, a person who did the work. She put on her jacket. She reached into the pocket and felt without looking the photograph and the 4 names and the folded evaluation report and the declassification notice, and she felt that they were all there, complete, present, hers. She walked forward. The record finally said what it should have said 7 years ago, and the woman who had carried the truth of it alone, through the silence and the skepticism and the weight of an outcome she could not verify, had never stopped being